Wyoming Territory, 1881. The Laramie Mountains cast long shadows across the valley as the last light of day painted the western sky in fiery hues. It was in this golden hour that Jackson Colt first saw her, a solitary figure standing at the edge of the dusty road, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if waiting for someone or something to emerge from the gathering dusk. The 25-year-old cowboy reined in his buckskin gelding, watching the woman from a respectful distance. The frontier had taught him many things, but chief among them was that a man survived by keeping to himself. The West was no place for sentimentality or connection, just grit, determination, and the will to face each dawn alone. Those who invited others into their lives only invited heartache when the harsh realities of frontier life inevitably tore them apart. Jackson had buried enough friends to know the truth of this, yet something about her stillness against the vast landscape pulled at him. Her light blue dress fluttered in the evening breeze, and her long blonde hair caught the dying sunlight like spun gold. She seemed both of this wild place and utterly foreign to it, too delicate, too perfect for the unforgiving terrain. Jackson adjusted his worn Stetson and nudged his horse forward, intending to pass by with nothing more than a polite nod. The woman was clearly waiting for someone, and whatever business she had on this lonely stretch of road was none of his. He had his own concerns, 30 head of cattle to deliver to Cheyenne and a reputation as a reliable drover to maintain. No time for distractions, no matter how lovely they might be. As he drew closer, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with a complexion that spoke of some protection from the harsh Wyoming sun. Her hands clutched a small leather-bound book, and despite her apparent composure, there was something in her posture that suggested vulnerability. "Evening, miss," Jackson said, tipping his hat as he prepared to pass. Good manners cost nothing, his mother had taught him before consumption took her when he was 12. The young woman turned, startled by his voice. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, but they were rimmed with red, telling a story of recent tears. "Oh, good evening, sir," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. She hastily wiped at her cheeks, composing herself with visible effort. Jackson hesitated. The code of the West demanded that he offer assistance to a woman alone at dusk, despite his personal conviction about the dangers of entanglement. "Are you all right, miss? It will be dark soon, not the safest place for a lady to be standing alone." Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am waiting for the evening stage, it should have arrived by now." Jackson frowned. "The stage doesn't run this route anymore, not since the railroad came through Laramie last year." The color drained from her face. "That cannot be right, I received a letter." "He was supposed to?" Her voice trailed off as she glanced back down the empty road. Something twisted in Jackson's chest, a feeling he'd long since buried beneath layers of frontier stoicism. Before he could reconsider, he found himself dismounting, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "Name's Jackson Colt, miss. I run cattle between here and Cheyenne." He kept a respectful distance but moved close enough to see the weariness etched in her young features. "If you don't mind my asking, who were you expecting?" She clutched her book tighter. "Katherine James," she offered, ignoring his question. "I have come from Boston to meet my fiancé. He works for the railroad and wrote that he would collect me from this spot today." The last light was fading now, the mountains becoming black silhouettes against the darkening sky. Jackson looked down the road in both directions. No sign of any travelers. "Miss James, the nearest town is Elk Hollow, about 5 miles back the way I came. There's a small hotel there. Whatever your situation, you can't stay out here after dark." Katherine shook her head. "He will come." Perhaps he was delayed. Jackson sighed, recognizing the stubborn hope in her eyes. He'd seen it before in men who refused to abandon played-out claims, in women who waited years for husbands who never returned from hunting parties or gold expeditions. "Miss, I don't mean to presume, but the night brings mountain lions down from the hills, and there are others dangers besides. If your fiancé is coming, he'll know to look for you in Elk Hollow." A wolf howled in the distance, as if to punctuate his point. Katherine glanced nervously toward the sound, then back at the empty road. "I suppose you are right," she conceded finally, "but I have no horse." Jackson hesitated only a moment before making an offer that contradicted everything he believed about staying uninvolved. "You can ride double with me to town. I'll see you safely to the hotel." This was how trouble started on the frontier, with one moment of misplaced compassion, yet he couldn't leave her here alone. That wasn't the Western code, no matter his personal convictions. Katherine assessed him carefully, her eyes taking in his worn denim, simple cotton shirt, and the six-shooter holstered at his hip. Whatever she saw apparently reassured her, for she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Colt, I would be most grateful." Jackson helped her mount and swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance despite the intimacy of the shared saddle. As they rode toward Elk Hollow, he found himself wondering about the man who would leave such a woman waiting in vain on a desolate road. He wondered even more why he cared. Little did he know that this chance encounter on a dusty Wyoming road would challenge everything he believed about life on the frontier and the walls he'd built around his heart. The small hotel in Elk Hollow was a two-story wooden structure with peeling white paint and a sign that swung creakily in the evening breeze. Jackson escorted Katherine inside, where a stern-faced older woman named Mrs. Winters informed them that Katherine's fiancé, a Mr. Edwin Blackstone, had not been seen in town. "I've been running this establishment for 15 years, Mrs. Winters said, adjusting her spectacles. "I know every soul who passes through Elk Hollow, and I haven't seen any Eastern Railroad men lately." Katherine's composure cracked slightly, but his letter specifically mentioned this date. Perhaps he left word for me elsewhere. "Mrs. Winters shook her head. "Post office, general store, and telegraph are all closed until morning. You're welcome to inquire then, but for now I have one room available if you need lodging." Jackson reached for his wallet. "I'll cover the ladies' room for the night." Both women looked at him with surprise. "That is not necessary," Katherine protested. "I have funds." "Consider it Western hospitality," Jackson replied, placing coins on the counter. He tipped his hat. "I'll check on you tomorrow before I continue to Cheyenne. Perhaps there will be news of your fiancé by then." Katherine studied him with those penetrating green eyes. "Why would you help a stranger this way, Mr. Colt?" The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? It contradicted everything he believed about survival in the West. "Out here, we look after travelers in need," he said simply. "Good night, Miss James." As he walked toward the small livery to board his horse, Jackson puzzled over his actions. One night's lodging was a small enough gesture, but it represented a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. The frontier demanded self-reliance above all else. Attachments were dangerous. They made you vulnerable when you needed to be strong. Yet he found himself thinking of Katherine's face as she stared down that empty road, hoping for someone who never came. Dawn broke with Jackson already awake, having spent an uncomfortable night on a cot in the livery stable. He tended to his horse, then made his way to the town's only cafe, where he ordered coffee and eggs. To his surprise, Katherine entered shortly after, looking remarkably composed despite her situation. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned, and she wore the same light blue dress, though it showed signs of having been carefully pressed. "May I join you?" she asked, approaching his table. Jackson stood and pulled out a chair. "Of course, I hope you slept well considering the circumstances." "As well as could be expected." She ordered coffee from the waitress before continuing. "I inquired at the post office this morning. There are no messages for me." Jackson studied her face, noting the tension around her eyes despite her calm demeanor. "The telegraph office." "Nothing there either. No one seems to know of any Edwin Blackstone associated with the railroad." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "I am beginning to wonder if I have made a terrible mistake." There was something in her voice, a vulnerability beneath the proper Eastern manners, that made Jackson lean forward. "Would you mind telling me how you came to be engaged to this man? Perhaps there's something in the story that might help us understand what's happened." Katherine hesitated, then reached into her small handbag and withdrew several letters tied with blue ribbon. "We met when he visited Boston on railroad business last year. He was charming, educated, and spoke beautifully about the opportunities in Wyoming territory. We corresponded for months before he proposed by mail." She passed Jackson a letter. The handwriting was elegant, the paper expensive. My father died last winter, leaving me with limited options. When Edwin suggested I join him here where he was establishing a new railroad office, it seemed providential. She reclaimed the letter, her fingers tracing the flowing script. He sent money for my journey and very specific instructions about where to meet him. Jackson frowned. Something about this tale raised his hackles, but he couldn't place why. May I ask how much money he sent? A flush crept into Catherine's cheeks. A considerable sum, enough for my ticket and to bring a portion of my inheritance to help establish our new life. Warning bells rang in Jackson's mind. The West was full of confidence men who preyed on Eastern women, particularly those with inheritance money, but he kept his suspicions to himself for now. The stage to Cheyenne leaves at noon, he said instead. I need to continue my cattle drive, but I can arrange passage for you if you wish to inquire at the railroad offices there. They might have information about your fiancé. Relief washed over Catherine's face. I would be most grateful, though I have already imposed upon your kindness too much. It's no imposition, my cattle and I are headed that way regardless. Jackson hesitated, then added, Miss James, I don't wish to alarm you, but there are those who prey upon travelers in these territories. Until we determine your fiancé's whereabouts, perhaps it would be wise to be cautious about your circumstances and especially about your inheritance. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Colt. I assure you I am not entirely naive, despite my current predicament. Something in her steady gaze made Jackson believe her. This was no simpering Eastern flower, despite her refined appearance. There was steel beneath those proper manners. As they prepared to depart Elk Hollow, Jackson arranged for Katherine to ride in the back of a supply wagon accompanying his cattle drive. It wasn't the most comfortable accommodation, but it was safer than the stage, which was frequently targeted by road agents. The wagon's owner, a gruff but good-hearted man named Henry Miller, agreed to take her along for a modest fee. Never could resist a damsel in distress, Henry said with a wink that made Katherine blush and Jackson inexplicably irritated. The journey to Cheyenne would take 3 days at the pace of the cattle drive. 3 days in which Jackson would need to maintain his professional focus, while increasingly finding his thoughts drawn to the mysterious Eastern woman with the absent fiancé. 3 days in which his carefully constructed belief that the frontier was no place for emotional entanglements would be tested as never before. The first day on the trail passed without incident. Katherine rode in Henry's wagon, occasionally walking alongside when the terrain allowed, asking thoughtful questions about ranch life and cattle drives that revealed a genuine curiosity about the West. By evening, when they made camp by a small creek, Jackson found himself impressed by her adaptability. You handle the trail better than most Eastern folks, he commented as he handed her a plate of beans and salt pork from the chuck wagon. Katherine accepted the food with a grateful nod. My father believed in practical education for both his sons and daughters. He would say that refined manners are useless without the strength to survive changing fortunes. Sounds like a wise man. He was, her voice softened. After Mother died, he raised 4 children alone while running his shipping business. He taught us that appearance and reality must align, that integrity matters above all. She poked at her beans. I sometimes wonder what he would think of my current situation. Jackson settled beside her, a respectful distance away. I reckon he'd be proud of your resilience. The campfire cast a warm glow on her features as she smiled. Perhaps. Though he might question my judgment in coming west to marry a man I scarcely knew. The cattle lowed softly in the gathering darkness. Jackson's ranch hands moved among them, singing low to keep them calm. It was a scene repeated countless times across the Western territories, men, beasts, and the vast open country beneath an endless sky studded with stars. The West requires faith, Jackson said after a long moment. Faith in yourself most of all. Katherine studied him. Yet you seem to have little faith in human connection, Mr. Colt. I notice how you keep apart from your own men. The observation, so accurate and unexpected, caught him off guard. The trail boss can't afford to be too familiar with the hands, he said, but the explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. Is that all it is? Her green eyes reflected the firelight, searching. Jackson stood abruptly. Dawn comes early on the trail, Miss James. You should get some rest. As he walked away to check the cattle one last time before turning in, Jackson felt unsettled. How had this woman so quickly seen through the walls he'd spent years constructing? And why did her presence make him increasingly question the solitary path he'd chosen? The second day brought trouble. Around midday, one of Jackson's hands spotted riders on a distant ridge, following the herd. Jackson counted 6 men through his field glasses, too many and too well-armed to be casual travelers. Rustlers? Henry asked quietly as they conferred behind the chuck wagon. Maybe, or worse, Jackson replied. We're carrying 30 head of prime beef and a woman with inheritance money. He glanced toward Katherine, who was walking alongside the wagon, unaware of the potential danger. What's the plan, boss? Asked Pete, his most experienced cowhand. Jackson considered their options. We'll change course, head toward Thompson's Pass instead of taking the main trail. It's narrower but more defensible if they make a play. That adds a day to Cheyenne, Henry pointed out. Better late than dead, Jackson replied grimly. He approached Katherine, keeping his manner casual. Miss James, I'd appreciate if you'd ride in the wagon for the remainder of the day. We're changing our route. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Is something wrong? Jackson hesitated, then decided honesty was the better course. We've spotted riders tracking us, probably nothing, but I prefer caution. To his surprise, she nodded calmly. I understand, should I be concerned? Not yet, but perhaps keep your valise close at hand. Katherine's gaze drifted to the distant ridge. My father always said that anticipating trouble was half of avoiding it. She climbed into the wagon without further comment. Jackson redirected the herd toward Thompson's Pass, a narrower route through a rocky section of hills that would force any pursuers to approach in plain sight rather than ambush them. By late afternoon, they reached the entrance to the pass, and Jackson positioned his men strategically, with Henry's wagon in the center of the formation. As dusk approached, Jackson's vigilance was rewarded when 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the pass behind them. They kept their distance but made no attempt to hide their presence. They're waiting for full dark, Pete muttered. Jackson nodded grimly. Double the watch tonight, no one sleeps alone. He approached Katherine as she helped prepare the evening meal, her sleeves rolled up and a determined expression on her face as she kneaded biscuit dough. Miss James, I need to speak with you privately. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him a short distance from the camp. Those men following us, I believe they may be after more than cattle, Jackson said bluntly. How many people knew about your journey and the money you were carrying? Katherine paled slightly. Only Edwin through our correspondence. I mentioned it in no other letters. And who else might have read those letters before they reached you? Her eyes widened with understanding. You believe Edwin may be connected to these men, that this entire arrangement was a scheme. Jackson hesitated, not wanting to destroy her hopes entirely, but needing her to understand the danger. I'm saying it's possible. The West attracts all kinds, those seeking honest opportunity and those looking to take advantage of others. We need to consider every possibility. To his surprise, Katherine's expression hardened with resolve rather than crumbling in despair. What do you need me to do? Stay close to either myself or Henry at all times. If there's trouble, get down and stay down. He hesitated, then added, and it might be wise not to mention your inheritance to anyone else. She nodded grimly. I may have been naive in coming west on the promise of marriage, Mr. Colt, but I am not helpless. My father taught all his children, daughters included, to use a firearm. Jackson raised an eyebrow, reassessing her yet again. That's good to know, though I hope it won't come to that. The night passed tensely, with the men taking shifts on watch. Jackson found sleep elusive, his mind filled with contingency plans and his ears attuned to every sound from the darkness beyond their campfire. Around midnight, he spotted Katherine sitting wrapped in a blanket, gazing into the dying embers. You should be resting, he said quietly, settling beside her. As should you, she glanced at him. Yet here we both are. The firelight caught the gold highlights in her hair, and Jackson was struck again by how out of place she seemed in this rough country, yet how quickly she was adapting to its challenges. May I ask you something, mister? Cold. Jackson, he corrected her. Out here, formality seems unnecessary. She smiled slightly. Jackson, then, what made you choose this life? The constant movement, the dangers, the isolation. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. It chose me in a way. My father was a drover. He taught me the trade before cholera took him when I was 16. By then I already knew cattle better than people, he shrugged. It's a straightforward life. The rules are clear. Cattle need water, grass, and protection. They don't complicate things with false promises or misplaced trust. Unlike people, Katherine said softly. Unlike people, he agreed. And yet, here you are, risking yourself to protect a stranger and her inheritance from men who might wish her harm. Her green eyes reflected the firelight. That suggests you believe some people are worth the complication. Jackson found himself without a ready answer. For years, he'd maintained that the frontier demanded self-reliance and emotional distance. Attachment was weakness. Connection invited pain when death or betrayal inevitably came. Yet here he was, risking his herd and his men to ensure Katherine's safety. Get some rest, he said finally. Tomorrow may bring challenges. As Katherine withdrew to her bedroll, Jackson remained by the fire, unsettled by the conversation and the emotions it stirred. Something about this woman was causing him to question truths he'd held as self-evident for most of his adult life. The idea both frightened and exhilarated him. Dawn came with a heavy mist shrouding the pass, limiting visibility to less than 50 yards. Jackson ordered the camp broken quickly, wanting to get through the narrowest section before their pursuers could organize an attack. The cattle moved sluggishly in the damp morning air, their breath forming small clouds as the drovers urged them forward. Katherine rode in Henry's wagon, her valise clutched tightly beside her. Jackson positioned himself at the rear of the formation, watching for pursuit through the swirling fog. The narrow walls of the pass loomed on either side, creating perfect positions for an ambush. Every sense was heightened as they moved slowly through the mist. When the attack came, it was from ahead rather than behind. Two riders emerged from a side canyon, blocking the path of the lead cattle. Simultaneously, shots rang out from the ridges on both sides of the pass. "Take cover!" Jackson shouted as he spurred his horse forward, drawing his revolver. The cattle began to mill in confusion, threatening to stampede in the confined space. Pete and the other hands worked frantically to control them while returning fire toward the ridges. Jackson reached Henry's wagon to find it stopped, with Henry slumped over, blood staining his shirt from a shoulder wound. Katherine had taken the reins and was struggling to control the frightened horses. "Get down!" Jackson ordered as he vaulted from his mount into the wagon seat, taking the reins from her. But instead of complying, Katherine reached into her valise and withdrew a small derringer. "I told you I wasn't helpless," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. A rider approached from the side, aiming for the wagon. Without hesitation, Katherine fired, striking him in the arm. The man yelled in pain and veered away. Jackson gave her an astonished look before turning his attention to maneuvering the wagon behind a large boulder for protection. He helped Henry into the wagon bed, then turned to survey the situation. The cattle were still milling nervously, but his men had them contained. 2 attackers were down, but at least 4 remained, firing sporadically from covered positions. "Who are they?" Katherine asked, reloading her small pistol with steady hands. "Probably hired guns," Jackson replied, returning fire at a flash of movement on the ridge. "Professional troublemakers looking for easy money." "Because of me. Because of what I wrote to Edwin about my inheritance." The guilt in her voice made Jackson pause. "This isn't your fault. The West is full of men looking to prey on others. You're just an opportunity they thought they found." "An opportunity provided by Edwin's deception," she said bitterly. "I see it all now, the careful correspondence, the promises, all designed to lure me out here alone." A bullet splintered wood near Jackson's head, forcing him to duck. "Recriminations can wait. Right now we need to get out of this pass." He surveyed their options. The narrow canyon continued for another quarter-mile before opening into broader plains. If they could reach that point, the attackers would lose their advantage of elevation. "Pete," he called to his foreman, "push the herd forward hard, we need to break through." Pete nodded, organizing the other hands to drive the cattle forward at speed. The sudden movement created a living barrier between the attackers and the wagon. Jackson turned to Katherine. "Can you drive?" She nodded firmly. "My father insisted. Get Henry to the other end of the pass. I'll cover you and meet you there." For a moment fear flashed in her eyes, but she set her jaw determinedly. "Be careful, Jackson." "Always am," he replied with more confidence than he felt. As Katherine took the reins and urged the wagon forward behind the moving cattle, Jackson mounted his horse and positioned himself between the wagon and the remaining attackers, his rifle ready. The thunder of hooves echoed through the canyon as the herd picked up speed, dust and mist swirling together in their wake. A rider emerged from behind a rock formation, aiming directly for the wagon. Jackson fired twice in rapid succession, striking the man in the chest. He fell from his horse without a sound. The remaining attackers, seeing their plan failing and their numbers diminished, began to retreat. As the canyon widened and the morning sun burned through the mist, Jackson allowed himself a moment of relief. They had survived, though not unscathed. He caught up to the wagon as it reached the open country beyond the pass. Katherine had handled it expertly, keeping pace with the cattle without overturning on the rough terrain. Henry was conscious but pale from blood loss. "We need to make camp and tend to the wounded," Jackson said, riding alongside. Katherine nodded, her face streaked with dust and her hair coming loose from its pins, but her eyes clear and focused. "Who were they, Jackson, truly?" He sighed. "Based on what we know, I'd say they were hired by your fiancé, or whatever his real name is. He likely had men watching the road where you were supposed to meet him. When I took you to Elk Hollow instead, they followed and gathered reinforcements." The realization of how thoroughly she had been deceived washed over Katherine's face. "I was a fool." "No," Jackson said firmly, "you were betrayed by someone who pretended to care for you. There's a difference." They made camp by a small stream, far enough from the pass to be safe from further attack. Henry's wound was painful but not life-threatening, and none of the other men had sustained more than minor injuries. The cattle were unharmed, though still skittish from the gunfire and rushed pace. As evening approached, Jackson found Katherine sitting alone by the stream, staring at the letters she had carried so carefully from Boston. Without a word, she began tearing them into tiny pieces and letting them drift into the current. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't found me on that road," she said without looking up. "If Edwin's men had been the ones to discover me waiting there alone." Jackson settled beside her on the grassy bank. "But that's not what happened." "No," she finally met his gaze. "Instead, I found perhaps the one man in Wyoming territory determined not to involve himself with others, yet who risked everything to help a stranger." Her words struck uncomfortably close to the contradiction Jackson had been wrestling with since their meeting. His entire philosophy of frontier survival centered on self-reliance and emotional distance, yet here he was, drawn inexorably into Katherine's orbit. "You challenged my assumptions," he admitted. "I've spent years believing the frontier is no place for connection, that out here, attachments are liabilities that get people killed." And now, her question hung in the air between them. Before Jackson could answer, Pete approached with urgent news. One of the wounded attackers had survived and was talking. He claimed they had been hired by a man named Harlan Porter, not Edwin Blackstone, to intercept an Eastern woman with inheritance money. "Porter operates out of Cheyenne," Pete explained. "Runs a legitimate-seeming investment office that fronts for all manner of swindles. According to our prisoner, he's been running this particular scheme for years, corresponding with Eastern widows and heiresses, promising marriage, then robbing them when they arrive." Katherine's face hardened. "And the authorities do nothing." Pete shrugged. "He's careful, uses different names, never meets the women himself. Without someone willing to testify against him, the law can't touch him." A determined look came into Katherine's eyes, one that Jackson was beginning to recognize and admire. "Then perhaps it's time someone did testify." "What are you suggesting?" Jackson asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm suggesting, Mr. Colt, that instead of avoiding Cheyenne, we head directly there, with me as visible bait to draw out this Mr. Porter." "Absolutely not," Jackson said immediately. "It's too dangerous." Katherine stood, brushing grass from her skirt. "More dangerous than being ambushed in a mountain pass? I think not." Besides, I have something now that his other victims likely didn't. What's that? She smiled grimly. I have you and your men as witnesses, and I have my father's determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. Jackson wanted to argue further, but the steel in her gaze stopped him. This was not the naive Eastern woman who had stood watching an empty road 3 days ago. This was someone forged by betrayal and danger into something stronger, something more adapted to the harsh realities of the frontier. And despite every instinct for self-preservation that had guided him for years, Jackson found himself admiring her transformation and wondering if his own beliefs might be ready for similar change. The plan they devised was simple but risky. They would continue to Cheyenne as intended, with Katherine making herself visible in town as a recently arrived Eastern woman. Word would spread, eventually reaching Porter or his associates. Meanwhile, Jackson and his men would deliver the cattle as planned, then position themselves strategically throughout town, watching and waiting. The territorial marshal in Cheyenne is a good man, Jackson explained as they rode side by side on the final day of their journey. Bill Hammond, if we can get Porter to show himself, Hammond will handle the rest. Katherine nodded, her posture straight and confident atop the mare Jackson had purchased for her in a small settlement along their route. She had abandoned her Eastern dress for more practical riding clothes, though she maintained a feminine appearance that would still mark her as out of place in the frontier town. And if Porter doesn't reveal himself, she asked. Then at least we'll have warned the authorities about his operation. It might not be enough to arrest him, but it could disrupt his business. They crested a rise and Cheyenne appeared before them in the valley below, a sprawling frontier town where cattle drives met the railroad, where East met West in a sometimes uneasy mingling of cultures and ambitions. It's larger than I expected, Katherine commented. The railroad changed everything, Jackson replied. Brought money, opportunities, and plenty of those looking to exploit both. As they rode into town, Jackson couldn't help noticing how Katherine drew attention, not just for her beauty, but for the confidence she now carried. The vulnerability he had first observed on that lonely road was still there, but it was now tempered with a frontier-forged resilience that made her somehow more striking. They parted at the Grand Central Hotel, the most respectable establishment in Cheyenne, where Katherine would stay while their trap was set. Jackson would complete his cattle sale and contact Marshal Hammond, then place his men in positions around town. Be careful, he warned her as they stood in the hotel lobby. Porter's men could be anywhere. Katherine adjusted her gloves, her green eyes meeting his steadily. As should you, Mr. Colt. I would hate to lose my reluctant protector before this adventure reaches its conclusion. There was something in her gaze that made Jackson's chest tighten. 2 days, he said, make yourself visible but stay in public places. Visit the shops, dine in the restaurant here, let word spread naturally. She nodded. I understand the role I'm to play, the vulnerable Eastern heiress, alone and unprotected. Just remember you're neither vulnerable nor unprotected, Jackson replied, tipping his hat before turning to leave. The cattle sale went smoothly, bringing a good price that would sustain Jackson's small ranch for months to come. Marshal Hammond listened carefully to their story, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. I've suspected Porter of such operations for years, he confirmed, but his victims either disappear or leave town too quickly for us to build a case. If your Miss James is willing to help set a trap, I'm more than willing to spring it. With the marshal's support, Jackson positioned his men around town. Pete would watch the hotel from the saloon across the street. 2 others would monitor Porter's investment office, a respectable-looking establishment on Cheyenne's main thoroughfare. Jackson himself alternated positions, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention. By evening of the second day, their patience was rewarded. Pete reported that a well-dressed man had been asking questions about Katherine at the hotel restaurant, specifically about whether she was traveling alone and how long she planned to stay in Cheyenne. He matches the description of Porter that Hammond provided, Pete said as they conferred in a quiet corner of the livery stable. 50-ish, silver at the temples, expensively dressed, gold watch chain. Jackson nodded. He's taking the bait, tell Hammond to be ready. Tomorrow, Katherine will visit the bank, making it clear she's transferring funds. That should force Porter's hand. The plan proceeded as they had hoped. The following morning, Katherine visited Cheyenne's largest bank, deliberately speaking loudly enough about her recent arrival from Boston and her need to establish a local account for her inheritance funds. Jackson watched from across the street as Porter himself followed her from the bank to a small cafe where he coincidentally took the table next to hers. Within minutes, he had introduced himself and engaged her in conversation. Even from a distance, Jackson could see Porter's practiced charm at work, the attentive posture, the ready smile, the calculated flattery that had likely won over countless women before Katherine. Something hot and uncomfortable twisted in Jackson's chest as he watched the interaction. He recognized it, reluctantly, as jealousy, an emotion he had thought himself immune to after years of emotional distance from others. The realization that he cared enough about Katherine to feel jealous was almost as disturbing as watching Porter's smooth performance. He forced himself to focus on the plan. Katherine would accept Porter's inevitable invitation to dinner that evening at the hotel restaurant. Marshal Hammond and his deputies would be positioned nearby, ready to act when Porter revealed his intentions or made reference to his scheme. Everything was proceeding perfectly until Katherine emerged from the cafe and started back toward the hotel. As she passed an alley, a rough-looking man suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her into the shadowed passage. Jackson was moving before he fully registered what had happened, racing across the street with his hand on his revolver. He reached the alley in time to see Katherine struggling with her assailant and Porter himself approaching from the other end of the narrow space. "That's enough, Larson," Porter called calmly. "Our guest deserves better treatment." The rough man loosened his grip on Katherine but kept her firmly in place. Porter approached, his charm replaced by cold calculation. "Miss James, I believe we need to have a frank conversation about your purpose in Cheyenne," Porter said. "You see, I make it my business to know about wealthy Eastern visitors, and something about your story doesn't quite add up." Katherine maintained her composure admirably. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Porter. Please tell your man to unhand me immediately." Porter smiled thinly. "I think not. You see, my associates informed me that you arrived with a certain cattle drover, one who interfered with my business a few days ago in Thompson's Pass." His eyes hardened. "That suggests you're not the innocent heiress you pretend to be." Jackson stepped into the alley, his revolver drawn. "She's not pretending anything, Porter. Let her go." Porter turned slowly, unsurprised. "Mr. Colt, I presume." "I thought you might be lurking nearby," he sighed dramatically. "This complicates matters." "The only complication is how many charges Marshal Hammond will file against you," Jackson replied, advancing slowly. "Fraud, attempted robbery, assault, and now kidnapping." Porter laughed, bold words from a man outnumbered in an alley. He gestured, and two more men emerged from doorways, both armed. Jackson assessed the situation quickly. He was indeed outnumbered, but he had positioned Pete across the street with a clear view of the alley. Help would be coming if he could just stall long enough. "You've been running this scheme for years, Porter," he said, keeping his gun trained on the man. "Corresponding with Eastern women, promising marriage, then robbing them when they arrive alone and vulnerable. A business model that worked perfectly until you interfered," Porter replied coldly. "Do you know how many lonely, wealthy women there are back east? How eager they are to believe a charming letter from a supposed frontier gentleman? It's almost too easy." Katherine's eyes flashed with anger. "Men like you are why decent women struggle to trust anyone. You twist natural human desire for connection into opportunity for theft." Porter laughed, "Rather sanctimonious for someone attempting to entrap me, Miss James. Though I must say your performance was convincing. For a moment, I almost believed you were another desperate spinster seeking Western adventure." "The only desperation I see is yours, Porter," Jackson said, taking another step forward. "The desperation of a coward who preys on women instead of making an honest living." Porter's face hardened. "Enough talk. Larson, take their weapons. We'll continue this discussion somewhere more private." Before Larson could move, a shot rang out from the street end of the alley. Pete stood there, his rifle aimed at Porter's men. "Drop your weapons!" Marshal Hammond's authoritative voice boomed from behind Pete as he and three deputies moved into position. What followed was brief but chaotic. Porter's men, seeing themselves surrounded, surrendered quickly. Porter himself made a desperate lunge toward Katherine, perhaps thinking to use her as a shield, but she was ready for him. She brought her knee up sharply, striking him in a way that would ensure his temporary incapacitation, then stepped smoothly aside as he crumpled to the ground. "My father believed daughters should know how to defend themselves as well as use firearms," she explained to Jackson's impressed gaze. That particular move he learned from a dock worker in Boston Harbor. Marshal Hammond approached, looking equally impressed. "Well done, Miss James. I've been trying to catch Porter in the act for over a year." He nodded to his deputies, who were handcuffing the still groaning Porter. "With your testimony and the evidence from his office, he'll be facing a long prison sentence." As the marshal's men led Porter and his associates away, Jackson and Katherine stood alone in the alley, the tension of the moment slowly ebbing. "Are you hurt?" Jackson asked, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. She shook her head. "Only my pride, perhaps. I should have been more careful leaving the cafe." "You were magnificent," he said, the words escaping before he could censor them. Not many could maintain such composure in that situation. A smile touched her lips. "I had excellent motivation and excellent company these past days." Her expression grew more serious. "Which brings us to an important question, Mr. Colt." "What's that? What happens now?" The simple question carried weight far beyond its words. What indeed? The danger was past, the villain captured, the adventure concluded. By all rights, they should part ways, Katherine to return east to her family and familiar surroundings, Jackson to his solitary life on the frontier that he had always insisted was the only one suited to him. Yet the thought of that separation felt wrong in a way Jackson couldn't ignore. The wall he had built around himself had crumbled during their brief time together, revealing a truth he had been denying for years. The frontier didn't demand isolation, it was he who had chosen it, out of fear rather than necessity. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in years I don't have a clear path forward." Katherine stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Perhaps that's not entirely bad. Clear paths rarely lead to new discoveries." "Are you suggesting we discover something together?" His voice was rougher than he intended. "I'm suggesting, Jackson Colt, that when I was standing on that road watching for someone who never intended to arrive, fate sent me someone who did." Her gaze held his steadily. "Someone who challenged everything I thought I knew about Western men, about courage, about connection." Jackson swallowed hard. "I'm a simple cattle drover, Katherine. I can't offer the kind of life you're accustomed to." "You misunderstand me," she replied softly. "I'm not asking for promises or proposals. Those I've had and they proved false. I'm suggesting that perhaps we both have more to learn about each other and ourselves before we decide what paths to take." The wisdom in her words struck him. This wasn't an Eastern fantasy of frontier romance. This was a thoughtful woman proposing something more genuine, a chance to explore what might exist between them without predetermined expectations. "I own a small ranch about 2 days' ride from here," he said finally. "It's nothing grand, just a cabin, a barn, and good grazing land, but it's peaceful, a place where someone might think clearly about their future." Katherine smiled. "It sounds like somewhere I might visit, perhaps, to continue our conversations about frontier philosophy and the value of human connection." "I'd like that," Jackson said, realizing as he spoke that he meant it more sincerely than anything he'd said in years. As they walked out of the alley into the bright Wyoming sunshine, Jackson felt as though he was emerging from a much longer darkness, the self-imposed isolation he had maintained since his father's death. Katherine had not only survived her encounter with the harsher realities of frontier life, she had thrived, revealing a strength and adaptability that matched his own. Perhaps the frontier wasn't a place that demanded emotional isolation after all. Perhaps it was a place that tested connections, strengthening those worthy of survival while breaking those built on false premises. 2 weeks later, Katherine sat on the porch of Jackson's ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The cabin was indeed simple but well-built and meticulously maintained. The surrounding land stretched in gentle, grassy slopes toward the foothills where Jackson's cattle grazed contentedly. She had sent telegrams to her siblings in Boston, explaining her situation and assuring them of her safety. Their replies had expressed concern but also trust in her judgment, a trust she valued more than they could know. Jackson emerged from the barn having finished the evening chores. He paused a moment, watching Katherine on the porch, still sometimes disbelieving that she had chosen to stay, even temporarily, in his simple frontier life. "Penny for your thoughts," he said as he approached, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "I was thinking about expectations," she replied, making room for him on the bench beside her. "How I came west expecting one life and found something entirely different." "Disappointed?" he asked, though her contentment seemed evident in her relaxed posture and the peace in her eyes. "Quite the opposite," she turned to face him. "I came seeking a husband but found instead a partner, someone who sees me as I am, not as an opportunity or a convenience." The weeks since their confrontation with Porter had allowed them to know each other without the pressure of danger or forced proximity. Katherine had helped with the ranch work, revealing both a willingness to learn and a quick intelligence that impressed Jackson daily. For his part, he had shared more of himself, his hopes for the ranch, stories of his parents, the dreams he had set aside in his determination to survive alone. "I've been thinking," Jackson said slowly, "about what you said about the frontier testing connections rather than preventing them." He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become increasingly natural. "I believe you were right. The West doesn't demand that we face it alone, it merely reveals which connections are strong enough to endure its challenges." Katherine's fingers tightened around his. "And what does that mean for us, Jackson Colt?" "It means I was wrong. For years, I believed that caring for someone out here was a liability, that it would only lead to pain when the harsh realities of frontier life tore us apart." He met her gaze directly. "But these weeks with you have shown me that the right connection doesn't weaken us against those realities, it strengthens us to face them." The setting sun cast a warm glow across her features as she smiled. "Are you proposing something, Mr. Colt?" "I'm proposing that you consider staying," he said, his heart beating faster than it had even during their confrontation in the alley. "Not as a visitor but as a partner in every sense. This land, this life, it could be ours together if you want it." Katherine looked out across the ranch, then back at the man beside her, a man who had found her watching an empty road and changed both their lives in the process. "I do want it," she said simply. "I want the challenge and the beauty and the truth of it, but most of all I want the partnership with a man who sees strength in connection rather than weakness." As Jackson drew her closer, the last light of day faded from the sky, and the first stars appeared above the Wyoming plains. Neither of them noticed, too absorbed in the discovery that sometimes the greatest frontier adventure isn't found in danger or gold or conquest, but in the courage to let down walls built for survival and discover that true survival depends on letting love in. 6 months later, the small church in Elk Hollow was filled with Jackson's ranch hands, neighboring homesteaders, and Katherine's siblings, who had traveled from Boston for the occasion. Katherine wore a simple white dress adorned with local wildflowers, and Jackson had traded his work clothes for a new suit that still couldn't hide his essential nature as a man of the land. As they exchanged vows before the frontier preacher, both reflected on the strange path that had brought them together, a path that began with a woman watching an empty road, waiting for someone who never intended to arrive, and a cowboy who wondered who she was waiting for. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would be harsh winters, difficult calving seasons, droughts, and all the unpredictable challenges the West could deliver. But they would face them together, their connection not a vulnerability but their greatest strength. And sometimes, in the years that followed, they would ride out to that stretch of road where they first met, now part of their expanded ranch, and marvel at how the greatest journeys often begin where we least expect them, and lead to destinations we never imagined possible.